Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
And our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you. Every major fight in America today, abortion, marijuana, education, taxes, immigration, comes down to one thing. Who gets the power, states or Washington? And today we're breaking down federalism, and it may change the way you see the government forever. But first, Bobbi gets us started with more about the man on our $100 bill.
This is our new continuing short series where we present the civic virtues that Benjamin Franklin, one of our most significant founders, thought to be the most important. He thought these civic virtues, or qualities that help individuals become better people and contribute to a stronger society, mattered just as much as public action. As we work our way through these, think about how these civic virtues track in your own life. And we are up to the 9th civic virtue, which is moderation. Franklin said, quote, "Avoid extremes, forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve," end quote. Can you think of a time when you kept your actions or reactions balanced?
And back to basics today. What is federalism? Part 2.
And now our feature presentation.
So in part 1 of What is Federalism, we pointed out that federalism in the U.S. government is the constitutional division of power between the national or federal government and state governments. Power is divided and shared between the federal government and state governments as designated in the U.S. Constitution, and powers granted exclusively to the national government are supreme. In part 2, we're going to examine how the concept of federalism has evolved and changed since its inception in 1787 under the U.S. Constitution. As our nation has grown and changed over the almost 237 years under the current Constitution, both Congress and the federal courts have shaped policy based on both the needs of the American people and how to manage those needs and stay in the bounds of the powers given under the Constitution. We will look at some of the ways federalism has been interpreted over the course of the 237 years of its existence in the United States. Before we get started, let's review key components of U.S. federalism. First, there are the enumerated or listed powers specifically granted by the Constitution to the federal or national government, including regulating interstate and foreign commerce, declaring war, and coining or making money, just to name a few. Then there are the reserved powers, or those given to the states, which are clarified in the 10th Amendment as powers not delegated to the federal government that are reserved for the states. These are things such as education, public safety, or what are known as police powers, and overseeing state courts. There are also concurrent or shared powers. These are the powers exercised by both the federal and state levels of government, such as taxing, building roads, and creating lower courts. Finally, we have the 6th Amendment, also known as the Supremacy Clause, which establishes that the Constitution and federal laws take precedence over state laws when conflicts arise. And there have been conflicts. Several of those conflicts have led to landmark or really impactful Supreme Court cases that have resolved some of the most significant conflicts and helped shape federalism. Most historians place the evolution and types of federalism in the U.S. into 3 time periods. First, there is dual federalism, which runs basically from the beginning, 1789, when the Constitution took effect, to around 1933. And I give these dates, and that depending on the sources that you look at, sometimes the end date there, the 1933, changes by a few years depending on how certain historians place these, but generally that's the time period of it. So all the way into the 20th century is dual federalism.
It's a long time, yeah.
And this is often referred to as layer cake federalism, where the federal and state governments operated in distinct, separate spheres or layers, with the federal government's focus on commerce, war, and money. We will be covering most of this dual federalism era in this episode, and it will be continued in the next episode, which is going to be part 3, because it's such a long time period. And early on, the reason it seems to be longer is because, the Constitution was new, and so they're finding parts that need to be tweaked. And so there were seemed to be a lot more court cases early on that helped to shape this idea of federalism. So that's why this seems to be the longest part.
And anytime we can talk about cake, I'm all in. I'm all in.
The next time period is called cooperative federalism, which runs from, again, about 1933 to around 1969. And this was the period triggered by the New Deal. And this period is known as marble cake federalism because it often saw federal and state governments cooperating to solve problems. So instead of each part being like, we do this, you do that, they cooperated and shared a lot more during this time period. So if you think of like a layer cake and you've got your distinct layers, and now marble, it's kind of mixed together. So swirly, think of it that way. But the federal and state governments during this time often cooperated to solve problems. And it was also a period marked by increased federal grants and aid to states. And we'll get back to that so that everybody understands what that means shortly. And then finally, the last period is new federalism, which again is about 1969 to currently, or the present time. And that began basically with around the Nixon presidency. And this area focuses on the devolution, or returning more power to state and local governments through things like block grants and reducing federal regulations. So now we're going to look at some major factors from each of these time periods as they relate to federalism. And I say that, but actually today we're just going to look at, since it's so long, the factors of dual federalism. So starting in 1789, again, this is often referred to as layer cake federalism because for much of this period, the federal and state governments operated within distinct, separate spheres or layers of jurisdiction, with the federal government focusing on commerce and foreign affairs, while states held most police powers. And in constitutional and legal terms, I know if we think of police, we're thinking about the guys in the blue and all that. Doesn't mean that here. Basically, in these terms, it means the authority that a government has to enact laws and regulations that protect the public's health, safety, morals, and general welfare. So it's kind of an umbrella. Yes, the police would be grouped in there, but we're also looking at public health measures like your local health department, looking at restaurants for sanitation and safety on the roads, for example, who determines the speed limit and that type of thing. So it's a broad regulatory power, and you shouldn't confuse it, again, with just thinking in terms of uniformed police officers. This era is characterized by a clear division of labor between the federal and state governments with little collaboration, hence the layer cake idea. This era is often subdivided into 2 time periods. And we're going to start with period 1, which runs from the beginning, 1789, to about the end of the Civil War, 1865. And it's focused on establishing national supremacy after the Constitution, dealing with disputes over states' rights, and culminating or ending with the Civil War. And then period 2, which picks up at the end of the Civil War, 1865, and then runs until around 1933. The post-Civil War era, where the federal government is slowly beginning to take more control while states still handled most of the daily matters of life. Again, this episode will cover period 1 up to about 1870. And then we'll go into the rest of dual federalism next episode. And I went to 1870 because the Civil War amendments are the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 15th is done in 1870, and those kind of go along or are a result of, what happened with the Civil War and before. So I wanted to kind of stop at a natural
that's a good break.
Stopping place. Back to the beginning, right out of the gate under the new Washington administration. Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, felt strongly that a national bank was needed to provide loans to the government, print and circulate money, and foster economic development in the new nation. Hamilton believed that establishing a national bank was wholly within the authority of Congress under Congress's implied powers, which we've talked about before. They're found in Article 1, Section 8, which is known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, also known as the Elastic Clause. Washington's Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, believed that Congress held no such authority, and he opposed creation of the national bank. But Hamilton prevailed and convinced Washington to sign the legislation that created a national bank. The charter of this new national bank would expire in 1811. And I give that because that's going to play an important role to how some of this changes over the course of just a short time. So from 1789 to 1811. This disagreement over the interpretation of the Constitution helped accelerate the creation of the nation's first political parties, the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, as well as the concept of what are called loose or broad interpretation of the Constitution, which is what Hamilton's view was, versus a strict constructionalism, which today a lot of times you'll hear them talked about as originalists.
Verbatim, word for word of what it says versus living and breathing.
In other words, originalists or constructionists, strict constructionists, they basically, I'm going to put this the way I kind of think of it, they don't believe necessarily in using the necessary and proper clause, or general welfare for that matter, because they believe the Constitution very literally. Whereas loose constructionists or loose interpretation, they're willing to look at, they put the necessary and proper clause in there because the framers realized that times would change.
Nation changes,
and they couldn't foresee all of the things that were going to happen. So we needed a way to allow Congress to deal with those unforeseen future problems or situations that might come up.
And still to this day on the Supreme Court, don't we have people that view it as the originalist? And then we've got both sides still today.
And more on the conservative side typically tends to be the strict interpretations. Yes. So the strict interpretation, very literal, explicit understanding of the Constitution, which then in turn basically they're favoring a limited government and original intent. Loose interpretation or the broad construction treats it as the way many constitutionalists think, as a living document, which goes along what I was just talking about, allowing those implied powers for modern needs or changing situations. Strict constructionists prioritize the exact wording, while loose constructionists focus on intended purpose and the making use of the implied powers. And we talked about all the political parties and that I've already, mentioned those interpretations in an earlier episode. So, if you want to go back and hear more explanation. Before the national bank issue comes to a head in 1811, the federal courts had already been busy settling disputes between the federal and state governments over their powers. In 1810, the Supreme Court ruled in the case Fletcher versus Peck that Georgia's legislature could not invalidate a contract because the Contracts Clause of the U.S. Constitution prohibited Georgia from voiding contracts for the transfer of land, even though they were secured through illegal means. In this case, it was bribery. Chief Justice John Marshall carefully noted that no disrespect was intended to Georgia or its legislature by this ruling, but Fletcher versus Peck established the principle that the Supreme Court has the power to strike down an unconstitutional state law. By 1816, the Supreme Court ruled in Martin versus Hunter's lessee that it could also override state courts and invalidate unconstitutional state laws. Back to the Bank of the U.S. When the bank's charter expired in 1811, Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans prevailed in blocking its renewal. However, the fiscal hardships that plagued the government during the War of 1812 coupled with the fragility of the country's financial system, convinced Congress and then President James Madison to create the Second Bank of the United States in 1816, again citing Article 1, Section 8's Necessary and Proper Clause. And I wanted to kind of stop there and talk about Madison for just a minute, because since he is known as the father of the Constitution and was one of the prolific writers of many of the Federalist Papers, I wanted to talk about the evolution of Madison's views on the Necessary and Proper Clause. Madison saw Article 1, Section 8, the Necessary and Proper Clause, as an essential mechanism or way for executing expressly granted federal powers. But in the beginning especially, he strongly opposed expansive interpretations that would allow Congress to invent new powers that weren't explicitly delegated by the Constitution. And earlier, in early times, in Federalist 44, Madison supported the clause as a logical necessity. He argued that without the Necessary and Proper Clause, the entire Constitution would be, quote, a dead letter, end quote. He believed it simply authorized Congress to use the exact means necessary to carry out its specific enumerated duties. His interpretation was tested in 1791 early on, when Hamilton proposed the first national bank, and Hamilton used the Necessary and Proper Clause to support this national bank. At that time, Madison fiercely opposed the bill, arguing that incorporating a bank was not a direct or necessary means of executing a granted power, and he warned against using the clause to grant Congress boundless authority. Also in 1798, Madison further clarified his stance in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were, again, we've talked about those briefly. When Adams was president, he had these Alien and Sedition Acts passed that were highly, highly controversial and ended up not lasting long. But Madison argued against using implied powers to justify federal overreach. He stated that the federal government was strictly limited by the text of the Constitution and the rights retained by the states. Now, moving forward to the time we're talking about here, in after the bank's charter expired in 1811, Madison is president in 1812. He famously ends up losing the battle over the bank's constitutionality during his own presidency, and he eventually concedes that the issue had been settled by longstanding political and legislative precedent. However, he maintained that the Necessary and Proper Clause must always tether legislation strictly to enumerated powers to prevent the erosion of states' rights. So, kind of a very politician-like evolution of Madison over that period of 1791 to
the early
1812. So,
but at least back then, it seems like that they could come to a consensus no matter how they got there, and then it was established and they moved on.
Knowing what I know about Madison, I don't think he would have caved, if you want to put it that way, or changed his mind, unless he saw that, okay, that we needed the bank the first time, and he saw the situation that was caused by now fighting this other war that took a lot of money away. So he was okay with changing his stance on something, which
we've talked about a lot of times, that we really respect people that can actually look at things and make up their mind and change how they feel.
So that was kind of a big sidebar, but I wanted people to see that, you know, even the father of the Constitution was able to transform his view over the course of time and necessity, seeing the need for something. Many states rejected the Second Bank of the U.S., arguing that the national government was infringing upon the state's constitutional jurisdiction. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States, a private corporation that handled all fiscal transactions for the federal government. A political showdown between Maryland and the national government emerged when James McCulloch, an agent for the Baltimore branch of the Second Bank, refused to pay a tax that Maryland had imposed on all out-of-state chartered banks. The standoff raised two constitutional questions. First, did Congress have the authority to charter a national bank? Second, were banks allowed to tax federal property? In McCullough versus Maryland, Chief Justice John Marshall argued that Congress could create a national bank even though the Constitution did not expressly authorize it. Under the Necessary and Proper Clause of Article 1, Section 8, the Supreme Court asserted that Congress could establish, quote, all means which are appropriate to fulfill the legitimate ends of the Constitution, and that's the end of that, quote. In other words, the bank was an appropriate instrument that enabled the national government to carry out several of its enumerated powers, such as regulating interstate commerce, collecting taxes, and borrowing money. This ruling established the doctrine of implied powers, granting Congress a vast source of discretionary power to achieve its constitutional responsibilities. The Supreme Court also established that Article 6 of the Constitution, known as the Supremacy Clause, meant that Maryland did not have the power to tax the bank. In 1824, one of the most significant cases regarding congressional powers came before the Supreme Court. In Gibbons versus Ogden, the court had to interpret the Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8. Specifically, it had to determine whether the federal government had the sole authority to regulate the licensing of steamboats operating between New York and New Jersey. This case involved competing steamboat ferry companies operating between New York and New Jersey. Aaron Ogden, who had obtained an exclusive license from New York State to operate his steamboat ferries between New York City and New Jersey, sued Thomas Gibbons, who was operating ferries along the same route under a coasting license issued by the federal government. Gibbons sued in New York State Court. He sued Ogden, and Gibbons ends up losing his case in New York State courts and appealed. It goes to the Supreme Court, which reversed the state court's decision, which had ruled in favor of Ogden, and based its decision for Gibbons based on its first interpretation of the Commerce Clause, which states that, quote, Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states, end quote. The court found that the word commerce included navigation among the states, and that the word among before the phrase the several states meant that Congress's commerce power, quote, did not stop at the external boundary line of each state, but may be introduced into the interior. So if you think about it, the waterways that like run, in this case, between two states, or like the Ohio River runs between several states, those waters belong to the federal government. The ruling states New York's exclusive licensing law a nullity, that's a quote, in light of the Supremacy Clause of Article 6 of the Constitution. This landmark decision by the Supreme Court expanded the authority of the federal government and recognized Congress's broad power to regulate commercial activity. By the Civil War, the federal courts had established several key principles of federalism, including the power of the federal courts to invalidate unconstitutional state laws, to nullify conflicting state court rulings, and to ensure the supremacy of federal law enumerated in the United States Constitution. Despite these early landmark cases further establishing federalism, the federal government still remained small and had little impact on most citizens who still identified with their states more than with the nation.
And I hear the bell, so that's a short break from civics and now to history.
Don't know much about history.
This is our Don't Know Much About History segment. They played an important part during the American Revolution in supporting the fight for independence, but their role is often overlooked. Although not allowed to fight on the battlefield, they contributed in many ways, such as serving as nurses, spies, and managing their family farms and businesses while their husbands were at war. We are, of course, talking about women. One of the most notable voices during the time was John Adams' wife, Abigail Adams, as he worked to promote independence And later, for the creation of the new government, Abigail famously wrote in a letter to him to, quote, "remember the ladies," end quote, as she advocated for protection of women's rights in the nation's new laws. Her fight for women's rights was just the beginning of the fight of women to have a voice in America's policies and politics. It would take another 150 years before the 19th Amendment was passed that finally gave women the right to vote. But women like Abigail Adams opened the door for others to fight on.
Okay, so with that, let's jump back into today's civic lesson.
Okay. So various states had fought against the nationalism of power that had been going on since President John Adams signed the Sedition Act in 1798, which made it a crime to speak openly against the government. And the Kentucky and Virginia legislatures passed resolutions declaring the act null on the grounds that they retained the discretion to follow national laws. In effect, these resolutions articulated the legal reasoning underpinning the doctrine of nullification, that states had the right to reject national laws they deemed unconstitutional. And this is important because this leads up to and is part of why the Civil War was fought, nullification and states' rights. So we're getting into that time period where that kind of becomes
prickly,
a very prominent issue over the next 20 years or so. So this nullification argument arose again in the 1830s over President Andrew Jackson's Tariff Acts of 1828 and 1832. John Calhoun, President Jackson's vice president, led the nullifiers who argued that high tariffs on imported goods benefited Northern manufacturing interests while disadvantaging economies in the South. Remember, at the time leading up to the Civil War, the North had become more industrialized or business focused, whereas the South remained agricultural.
Yes.
And depended on exports, exporting their cotton and all that stuff. So that's why the South did not like these acts, these tariffs that Jackson had imposed. So South Carolina, which was Calhoun's state, passed an ordinance of nullification declaring both tariff acts null and void and threatened to leave the Union. Remember, we're just in the 1830s.
Right.
The federal government responded by enacting the Force Bill in 1833, authorizing President Jackson to use military force against states that challenged federal tariff laws. The prospect of military action, coupled with the passage of the Compromise Tariff Act of 1833, which lowered tariffs over time, led South Carolina to back off temporarily, ending the nullification crisis. And I added temporarily in there because, like I said, again, we're going to see this
flare up,
become more and more of an issue leading up to the Civil War. The ultimate showdown between national and state authority came just before and just after the Civil War. Prior to the conflict, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in the landmark decision Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857 that the United States Constitution did not extend U.S. citizenship to people of Black African descent, and therefore they could not enjoy the rights and privileges the Constitution conferred upon American citizens. And I'll stop there. What they meant by that is Dred Scott was a slave that had been moved from one state to another, and his rights and privileges that they're talking about, being a slave, he was not considered a citizen. So the court said he didn't have a right to bring a case to a court. No standing, right. Also, Dred Scott struck down the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and said that the national government lacked the authority to ban slavery in the territories. And for those of you in terms of history, the Missouri Compromise had been enacted and where it made it so that as our country was expanding, every other state that was added, it was like a slave state, free state. We're going to add a free state, then a slave state. So to keep things balanced was the whole, so that slavery would not become too big of an issue. That's kind of really simplifying it, but that's essentially what it did. The Supreme Court had hoped that the Dred Scott decision would settle the slavery issue, but it only made it worse by causing more tension between the northern states, which had banned slavery, and the southern states, which still relied on slavery for its economy. In 1860, the Republican Party explicitly rejected the Dred Scott decision in their official platform. The party ran a relatively unknown candidate from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, as their presidential candidate in 1860, which further inflamed the southern states who believed that Lincoln would try to abolish slavery in the southern states. In reality, Lincoln and the Republican Party only wanted to stop any further expansion of slavery into new territory as the U.S. spread westward. So their platform was stopping the spread of slavery. It never was the abolition of slavery. And Lincoln even spoke about that numerous times, but the Southerners, they thought that was a lie, and, that their ulterior motive was to abolish slavery. And it's kind of funny because by seceding and starting the Civil War, they ended up forcing that.
They forced the hand, yeah.
Yeah, they forced that hand, yes.
And lost.
So Lincoln won the 1860 election, but mainly because the Democratic Party was split into three factions with three different candidates. So there were 5 total candidates in the 1860 election. We had Lincoln as the Republican. We had 3 different Democratic candidates, a Northern and a Southern and another one. And then we had the Constitutional Union candidate from Tennessee. So when you have, especially those 4 pulling and dividing all of the other votes, Lincoln ends up with a slim majority.
And took it.
So, yeah. But Lincoln's victory proved to be too much for the southern states, and before he even was inaugurated and took over as president in March of 1861, 7 southern states, led by South Carolina, and they started in December. So the election was November. By December, South Carolina and these other states start seceding from the United States, claiming states' rights allowed for secession because they didn't like what the federal government was doing, or in this case, they thought was going to do, abolish slavery. They decide to secede. By February of 1861, and Lincoln still had not been inaugurated yet, because in 1860's inauguration was in March, not January like it is now. So by February, these states had formed the Confederate States of America, and by June of 1861, 4 more southern states had seceded and joined the Confederate States of America. So Lincoln is inaugurated in March. By April, the Civil War had broken out between the Union and Confederacy. So not even barely a month into his presidency, we have the Civil War starting. The Civil War threatened the survival of the American experiment. Could states legitimately claim a right to secede from the nation? President Lincoln passionately opposed the idea, stating in his first inaugural address, quote, "Plainly, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. Physically speaking, we cannot separate. No state, upon its own mere motion, can lawfully get out of the Union," end quote. Secessionists strongly disagreed with Lincoln. Jefferson Davis, who became the president of the Confederate States of America, stated, quote, "I have for many years advocated as an essential attribute of state sovereignty the right of a state to secede from the Union," end quote. Of course, the South ends up losing the Civil War, and its defeat allowed for a greatly expanded power of the federal government. According to the authors of The Foundations of U.S. Federalism, Rosenthal and Joseph, this defeat, quote, "destroyed the doctrine that the Constitution was a compact among sovereign states, each with the right to interpose or nullify an act of Congress, and each with the ultimate right to secede legally from the Union," end quote. The Civil War removed any doubt that the federal government, which derives its sovereign power from the people, not the states, is supreme when acting within the scope of its enumerated powers. The Constitution does not protect the sovereignty of the states, but on the contrary, the Constitution divides authority between federal and state governments for the protection of individuals, or the people, and for other constitutional ends. From a historical perspective, the national supremacy principle introduced during this period did not so much narrow the state's scope of constitutional authority as restrict their encroachment on national powers. After the Civil War, the nation entered what is known as Reconstruction, which not only included literally reconstructing the physical parts of the U.S. that had been damaged during the Civil War, but also rebuilding or reconstructing the roles of the federal and state governments. There was much disagreement about how to treat the former Confederate states. Could the U.S. return to the relationship between federal and state governments that existed before the Civil War, or did there need to be fundamental changes to that relationship to prevent the continuation of the causes of the conflict? 3 new constitutional amendments in the 5 years following the Civil War attempted to answer that question. These amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, are often referred to as the Civil War Amendments, which is what I've always seen them as, but I also saw them in researching this called the Reconstruction Amendments, which I had not seen before as much as I've studied history, but I put it in here because maybe in modern, maybe more historians now are referring to them that way. I don't know. They altered the balance of federalism in the U.S. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the U.S., and the 15th Amendment guaranteed all citizens the right to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But I want to point out all citizens still only meant males at this time. Sometime we need to do an episode on the wording of like the Declaration and this type of thing where, yeah, those words didn't mean the same thing back then because of the way society thought of the roles of male and female. So this just really meant males of other color or race or, whether they were slaves before or not got the right to vote, not females. And then I saved the 14th Amendment for last.
I noticed that.
It's the longest of the 3 of these. It imposed substantial restrictions on state power and expanded the power of the federal government. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, first of all, overruled the Supreme Court's 1857 ruling in Dred Scott versus Sanford that held that African Americans were not entitled to any of the rights of citizenship. It also incorporated the Due Process Clause, and that means that due process, as spelled out in the 5th Amendment, now applied to the states as well. That's what, when you hear incorporation, they're moving it to not only mean the federal government, but the states' governments. This has since been interpreted to incorporate the due process and equal protection clauses to restrict or bar state regulation in diverse areas, such as abortion and same-sex marriage, for example. Section 5 of the 15th Amendment grants Congress the power to enforce the 14th Amendment, which provides a potentially broad grant of federal power. So the federal government's going to protect all of these things. So if the states do try to encroach, it's up to the federal government to basically make a stand or make a determination on it. Now, this is a natural place to end part 2 of what is federalism. At the start of this episode, I pointed out that historians divide federalism into 3 distinct time periods, and we're still in dual federalism, which we'll finish up in part 3. So we have from 1870 to around 1933, and we'll also cover cooperative federalism and new federalism. So we're going to break while we're still in that dual federalism era. But after the Civil War, the U.S. changes a lot. It moves from mostly agrarian or agricultural country into more of an industrialized country, and that itself creates new challenges for federalism and the courts. So we will pick up in the late 1800s in part 3 of what is federalism.
Yeah, pop quiz time.
Bueller.
Last episode's question: who is the United States Chief Supreme Court Justice currently?
And if you said John Roberts, you would be correct.
John Roberts.
Who does have an Indiana connection.
He does. Is it Notre Dame?
Yeah. This episode's question from the U.S. Naturalization Test is, under our Constitution, some powers belong to the federal government. What is one power of the federal government? So there are 17 enumerated powers.
17.
So you can name one of those. And I'd go for the simpler ones. There are some easy ones there. So if you can name one of them, you can pat yourself on the back. But we'll tell all next time.
Cool. And we'll get to part 3 next time. Before we wrap up today, I have a Netflix subscription, and I'm always looking for fascinating historical documentaries or dramatized movies about the past. And I caught one, and I don't know if you've seen it, but it's called Death by Lightning. Have you?
I have not.
Okay, so this is something I think our listeners might find interesting. Death by Lightning is a recent Netflix historical drama about the assassination of James Garfield, which is a president that almost seems forgotten to history. And it's fascinating. It stars Michael Shannon. And so that's going to be my recommendation for folks. If they're looking for something, I'm always looking for something to watch. Death by Lightning. Right now I'm watching The Pit, because you told me I had to watch The Pit, and now I'm hooked like a fish. We've been binge watching, and it's nice out today, so I wonder how many episodes we're going to get into. But there's another one for you, is The Pit, which is set in an emergency room in Pittsburgh, and it's fascinating.
What I found interesting, because I just found it like a month ago, is that each season is just one day.
Shift.
One day. So like 14 or 15 episodes, and they're all just surrounding lots of different things that happen in one day's time.
It's amazing. And I will say that my daughter is a nurse. I think our listeners know that. So I already have spent a lot of time in the medical rooms for my heart. And so she's a nurse, but this The Pit gave me a brand new respect for people that work in medicine, especially in emergency medicine. It's completely given me a whole new layer of respect.
My mom had a friend that was an emergency room nurse, and some of the stories that she could tell. Of course, she couldn't say patient names, obviously, but some of the things that people come to the emergency room for.
Yeah, and that's the thing of the emergency room too. You just don't know from minute to minute what you're going to be dealing with, and wow.
I'm only maybe a couple episodes into season 2, but it's set on 4th of July.
Right.
So I thought, well, that's interesting, because she would tell us 4th of July, Halloween,
and full moons.
New Year's are like the worst.
Yeah. Those are like, well, I suppose if you work that shift, you kind of know what you're getting into. So there's a couple recommendations if folks want to know what we're watching.
Well, I'm going to be watching the Fever game today. So
yes. Okay. We'll go Fever. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us. It is plaincivicspodcast@gmail.com, or you can go to our Facebook page and just type in Plain Civics and find us there. And maybe you've got something that you want to recommend to us to watch. We would love that. Or if you have a comment about this episode. But that's going to do it for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics. No politics, just facts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and...
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works, so you can make the government work for you.